Tucker, I'm going to go to you. Obviously, you think of Benghazi. You think of the YouTube video that she created that was a total lie. I mean, or excuse me, said that was a total lie, which was the reason for the Benghazi attack. I also think of President Clinton saying it depends on the definition of what is.
Sure.
They've been distorting reality for decades.
Well, they're politicians. They lie, of course. So the hypocrisy angle is, you know, ripe. But what's the threat here? Is the threat that somehow Americans are so dumb they're going to have their minds controlled by foreign propagandists in Moldova? Or is the real threat that our government is going to decide it's in the business of classifying some information as news and some as verboten? We're going to take steps in the Congress to filter out fake. Are you joking?
Yeah.
This is a direct threat to the First Amendment. I'm not defending inaccurate material online. There's a lot of it, but I'm an adult and I can tell the difference, or I think I can, or in any case I don't want some politician deciding they're going to filter my news because they think some of it's fake. I mean, whoa, bells are going off.
Absolutely.
You said, think about the groups who use the flag, from police officers to the U.S. Army. These are the forces on the ground that make oppression happen. Now, the obvious point is, obviously, if the police and the Army were to go away, sensitive college students like you would be eaten alive. Let me ask you a deeper question, which is, you find America unfair? Okay. What's a fairer country? Can you think of a country where you'd rather, for example, go on trial for a felony?
There isn't really a country I'd rather be tried for a felony in. I really doubt that it's not really about me, you know. It's about black people and people of color in this country who, if they were tried for a felony, are much more likely than me to be put in prison for that.
Okay,
and I'm sure
I'll shift the question there. And by the way, I'm not arguing, never would argue that there aren't inequities here, that it's a perfect country or anything like that. Of course not. But is there a country in which African Americans would stand a chance of a fairer trial than the United States? Is there a fairer country? I mean, I guess my question is, like, do you have perspective on the world when you say that all police and all cops are bad? Do you really know what you're talking about?
Do I have perspective on the world? Yeah, I'm well aware that the United States is militarily involved in over 7 different countries right now. Beyond Iraq and Afghanistan, they're involved in Libya. They're involved in plenty of countries in Africa. We have drone bases across the world, and I think that the U.S. Imperial Forces are really the main force in the world right now, using military force to oppress people. And I think that while that's like a useful question to ask, like, which country would I rather be in? I'd rather that we focus on this country and how we can, you know, fix and improve this country.
But why is
the flag isn't this.
Okay, I get it, but and I think we should fix and improve the country. But you're basically saying the flag represents evil to the extent that it shouldn't be flown. And my question is, why is it always rich kids who make that point? Why is it always kids from a $62,000 a year college like Hampshire who are making that point? None of the workers who you claim to be representing ever say that. You never see anybody at a trade school burning the American flag. Have you noticed that? I'm not making this up in my mind, am I?
I think that you're more likely to pick up a story in which rich kids do burn a flag on the basis that we have more access to the media. I mean, like, the flag burning wasn't
really? So you think it's like your average HVAC repair school, they're burning the flag? I keep reading these stories about people breaking down on college campuses, and I try to put myself in your position as a professor. So you have a kid come into your class crying about the election. As the adult, shouldn't you say, you know, it was just an election, and it was democratic, and nobody got cancer, and nobody died, and maybe you should toughen up a little? Why wouldn't you say something like that?
I think for many students, the result was, as for many people in the United States, a surprise. And I taught my class shortly after Hillary Clinton gave her concession speech. And for many students, particularly for young women, it was something a glass ceiling to break, to aspire to have a woman as president of the United States. And so I don't think it's about, as you were saying, being hysterical, but it's about processing and having a space to make sense of what happened and to have a discussion.
I get it, but it's also about having safe spaces. And at the University of Michigan Law School, where adults presumably attend, and I'm quoting now, post-election self-care and food and play. So this included Play-Doh and Legos, a safe space for people to go to, you know, feel, I don't know what. And that is kind of the question to you. What is a safe space exactly?
Well, in my opinion, the role of higher education is to foster debate, but also to be cognizant of students that are coming to our campuses from many different backgrounds, I work at DePaul University, which is an urban campus here in Chicago, a very diverse campus. And so, for example, in my class, the way that I approached it the day after the election was to return to themes that we had talked about prior to the election in terms of the role of a press in a free society. And
okay,
the role
but wait
of the press
a second. I'm sorry to interrupt
state.
you. And I think those are great questions, and I'm glad that you're raising them. But the role of the university, in practical terms, is not to foster a debate. It's to squelch it. And so people who disagree are crushed, and people who agree with the herd are elevated. I mean, is there really a debate? Do you know a single DePaul University professor who voted for Trump and said so out loud? Do you know one?
You know what? I do not talk about my personal political leanings with my colleagues.
You know as well as I that there isn't any at all. And isn't that a problem? Isn't that a lack of diversity?
I don't think that you have any evidence to support that claim, and that's actually not the right question. The right question is the role of the university to, again, I teach journalism, and so what I said to my students the day after the election was returning to the role of a press in a free society. And our role as journalists, as you would know, is to hold all elected officials accountable, regardless of our personal political leanings.
But also our powerful people. And you're a professor, and so you fall into that category, if I can say, as someone to whom others look for guidance. And I just kind of want to press you on this diversity question. So the whole idea of diversity is that the airless room produces bad decisions. We need people from different walks of life who have different points of view in order to make wise decisions. I think that's the underlying justification for it. And yet, in academia, there's virtually no one who disagrees from the liberal orthodoxy. Isn't it, and this is a sincere question, isn't it time for some sort of affirmative effort to bring people who disagree from other walks of life into your world? Well, let me just say a couple things. One, having a great-grandparent who may or may not have been Native American is not a qualification. Being 1/32nd of some racial group is not a qualification. Okay, it's an accident of history. It's something over which you had no control and for which in a just society you would not be rewarded. And so this is an amusing story. Obviously, her campaign's blowing up over this. She's lying. Her remark about, all Indians have high cheekbones. You know, I also like feathers. I mean, it's so offensive and dumb. But leaving that aside, it provide a window into a system that is fundamentally corrupt, that rewards people based on their DNA, which is inherently unfair. It was unfair when it happened under segregation, and it's unfair now. Indeed, it's indefensible. And that's why she doesn't want to talk about this, because she did gain material advantage by lying about her ethnic background. And no one should gain advantage because of his ethnic background, period.
Harvard has been very clear that she did not gain any material advantage.
No, it has not been clear.
And at the end of the day, she won the teaching award at Harvard 2 years in a row. She won teaching awards at the University of Pennsylvania, at the University of Michigan, at the University of Houston. To question this woman on her qualifications is going to be something that does appeal to folks like you, voters like you, bow tie and white boys. But at the end of the day, it is going to backfire against women who will be absolutely against questioning this woman who has...
All right, let him respond. Jimmy, go ahead, Tucker.
You can use name calling all you like, but you're ignoring the truth, as you know,
I didn't call
which
your
is
name.
Harvard does award material advantage to people based on their skin color. As you know, Harvard bragged about the fact that she was, quote, a minority professor. She's in no sense a minority. She didn't grow up speaking an Indian language on a reservation immersed in Indian culture. She couldn't name the tribe that her so-called ancestor was a member of when first asked. She's not American Indian. She posed as one, and Harvard, by its own admission, gives advantage to people who claim to be minority. So that's not
Tucker,
one right-winger's opinion. That's a fact.
Starting just at the very beginning, shouldn't you get... I've never seen a poll that suggests the majority of Americans support Obamacare, so shouldn't you get buy-in from the public before reorganizing their health care?
The public likes many of the provisions. You poll, keeping your child on your parent's plan till age 26, almost 80% of the public likes that. The public, of course, would like their cake and eat it too, but you cannot have both of those.
Before you continue to patronize the public, let me just make one thing really clear. So the poorest segment of our society is young people. In fact, this generation is the poorest generation of its age in 3 generations. They're the poorest. And yet we're forcing them to buy into the system to subsidize the health care of the old and the sick, who are also the richest segment of our population. Why is that fair, and why would you expect them to like it?
Well, first of all, young kids are subsidized in the Obamacare plan. If they don't make above 100% of poverty, they go on Medicaid, and they get almost cost-free health care. And if they are on the low end of income, they are very heavily subsidized to get health insurance. They're not spending a lot of money for peace of mind and protection. And I think that is a good deal. One of the reasons I'm
but they don't think it's a good deal.
Tucker, are you going to let me finish the mic?
Well,
one of the reasons I'm so passionate about
they don't seem to think it's a good deal. That's why you're trying to force them to do it, right? Am I missing something? I just trying to get a straight answer from you. You're trying to force them to do something they don't want to do. You're telling them it's a good deal, but they don't believe it's a good deal.
Oh, there's certainly been a lot of very bad rhetoric and very bad attacks on it, rather than give it its fair shake.
Are you going to blame right-wing talk radio?
Well, Hillary Clinton's proposal to accept tens of thousands of additional Syrian refugees could run taxpayers $403 billion in lifetime costs if it's implemented. Is the Democratic presidential nominee's plan a good idea for the country? Joining us now is Democratic strategist Demiki Konst. She's the host of The Filter on SiriusXM Progress. Demiki, it's great to see you this morning.
Good morning.
So importing a lot of Syrian refugees is one of those ideas that everyone we know is totally in favor of. Everyone in the press, everyone in politics, all the business community, everyone who's rich and well-educated and insulated from the effects of this policy is totally for it because it makes us all feel virtuous. Why don't you explain to me crisply why an unemployed machinist in Cleveland would be for this? What does he get out of this?
Well, it's actually quite simple. First thing, this is something that we've been doing for about 64 years. We're part of an international treaty that brings in refugees, and we actually bring in far fewer than most of the world, especially when it comes to Syrian refugees. You know, thinking about it in a really basic way, it takes the burden off of these other countries. The great thing about our country is that we are separated by an ocean, so they have to go through 5 screening agencies: the Department of Defense, State Department, Homeland Security, the UN, and one other that I forgot.
Okay, so I disagree with almost everything you said, but you still haven't answered my question, which is, why should the average American taxpayer who's not rich, who's not benefiting from the current status quo, see this as good for him or her?
Well, number one, it comes out cost neutral in the end. They're forced to reimburse their own flights. They have to take employment. They're heavily screened.
False. But leaving aside the falseness of what you said, why is it good? Why should the average person, the powerless person, the kind of person who's not for this, currently being lectured by the elites, why should that person be for this? What do Americans get out of this?
So what's going on right now is they don't have a firm screening process in Europe right now. They're coming in over little boats, and they can't screen them, and they're going through multiple countries. The EU does not have a handle on this. We are not accepting. It's a 36-month waiting period. We are not accepting it at the refugees at the rate that these countries are. They're going through screening. And so what that does is it lessens the burden. When there's more screening coming from our country, it makes it a safer process.
So it makes this country safer to import Syrian refugees. That's what you're saying?
Well, when they're screened multiple times.
But it makes it safer than it is without them? So it's good for Germany, which destroyed its country by opening the borders. I get that. It's good for tons of other countries. I totally get that. But American taxpayers have got to be expected to care about their own country first, shouldn't they?
I understand the taxpayer argument, but they've actually done studies on this to show that it's neutral, because they take jobs, they have to take jobs, they have to pay taxes, they're reimbursing flight costs and a lot of the costs that you would think are part of the budget. So it ends up being cost neutral.
But we have massive unemployment in this country, massive.
Massive.
Our workforce participation rate is the lowest since the 70s. So why at a time when ordinary people who want to work can't find jobs, why would we be helping people from other countries get those jobs?
Well, that's a business problem. That has nothing to do. That's
a social and
well, when you have companies going overseas and settling overseas and taking jobs away from America, that's a problem.
Well, you just said the U.S. government is bringing people in and requiring them to get jobs that presumably some Americans would like. Why is that good for Americans?
You know, unfortunately, in a lot of these situations, they're low-level jobs like McDonald's, and you know, these are the types of jobs that they're getting that most Americans, especially educated Americans, which you know is a higher and higher rate every year, and those who are unemployed, are not taking. So the jobs that we Americans are not taking anymore, or that we've left to younger people, or you know, people who are retirees. So it actually ends up being a cost.
So the black youth unemployment rate is like the highest in my lifetime. So you would say to them, "Sorry, it's going to a Syrian refugee."
No, I think you're jumping from one extreme to another, Tucker.
Seems related. Wait, hold on. You just made a specific allegation, and I think it's fair to ask you to back it up. You said that rhetoric during the campaign, presumably from the Trump campaign, included abridging the voting rights of African Americans, specifically African Americans. And I'm just asking you to cite that. What are you talking about?
So in Texas and North Carolina, there have been real efforts to roll back the voting rights legislation of recent decades and to keep people from the polls. And whether that means restricting early voting, whether that means making it harder for people to get to the polls, having fewer polling stations. I'm also referring to the very explicit
efforts
to
race
roll
specific.
back.
I mean, look. You know, people respect you as a scholar and a university president, and you're throwing around a lot of intemperate rhetoric that you can't back up. I mean, there was no specific effort. I don't know what I don't know what you're talking about, and I think it's unhelpful to make that allegation. But let me just say, finally, you said here, and I'm quoting, "Now, like so many around the country, I find myself wondering whether I should have done more to prevent the election of Donald Trump. And I'm wondering what you mean. What could you, as the president of a liberal arts college or university in Connecticut, have done to prevent the election of Donald Trump?
What I could have done was to ensure that students at Wesleyan who were on the right or the left turned their attention more to national politics. I do think that what I was getting at in that op-ed was that I feel that many of our students on college campuses are being more political now after the election than they were before, that they didn't engage in the political system. And the fact is, right now, we have a new administration coming to power, and I think it's important for us to take stands of principle, not to choose a la carte what laws we're going to obey, but to articulate our principles and to do our best to participate in the public political process. And I think many of our students abdicated that responsibility.
But you say here you wish you'd done more to keep Trump from getting elected. I mean, that's something that a political consultant would say. You're a university president. Do you really see your job as that partisan to prevent a specific candidate from getting elected? So you wrote a piece about this earlier this year, long before this attack, but basically arguing that Islamophobia, dislike or fear of Muslims, is one of the drivers of terrorism. And you said this: what can we do about the tiny fraction of Muslims committing such unspeakable violence we saw in San Bernardino, Paris, and Brussels? You don't address problems within the religion or the Islamic community. You turn it instead back on America and the West by saying our intolerance causes this. Am I misreading your point?
I think it's complicated, right? So I think at the outset we need to make clear that there's never a justification for a tragedy such as this one, right? So irrespective of the fact that someone may have suffered from bigotry or discrimination on account of their religious identity, that doesn't justify taking matters into your own hand and perpetrating or inflicting violence on professors and students or innocent civilians more generally. By the same token, I think with respect to the article that you're referencing, I was actually relying on research that came out of Stanford University that showed that essentially anti-Muslim bigotry and discrimination, or what we commonly refer to as Islamophobia, can contribute to a sense of what they term as cultural homelessness. This idea, particularly for newcomers, for immigrants to this country, where they don't necessarily feel that they identify with their home country, where they originally came from, and they also feel alienated from their new host country.
Right.
So in this case, the United States of America.
But you can see why this looks a lot like victim blaming. So you've had an awful lot of Americans killed and injured by Islamic terror in the past 8 years. A lot, almost 100 killed, 350 or more injured. And you're basically saying that that happened because America is not hospitable enough to Muslims, and that seems unfair.
Absolutely not. First, I think we need to take a step back and understand that there's actually a greater threat of terrorism from white supremacist groups and right-wing extremists than there are from individuals who self-identify as Muslim.
Well, that's just not true, actually. No, it's not. There haven't been 100 Americans killed in the last 8 years, 350 wounded from right-wing extremists in the United States. That's not true. And if you claim it is, I'd ask you to cite your source.
The FBI. So according to the FBI, the FBI data indicates that there have been more acts of terrorism committed by right-wing extremists and white supremacists. In addition to that, last year, Duke University...
In the last 8 years, there have been 100 or more than 100 people killed by white supremacists and more than 350 wounded by white supremacists in America. That's not true.
So I'm referring to the number of acts of domestic terrorism, as opposed to victims. So
look, I mean, obviously you're making a point that is unsupportable. I'm talking about actual acts of terrorism. People die, people get wounded. I mean, we can define terrorism many different ways. I'm just saying you've had an awful lot of people killed by Islamic extremists, and what I hear you saying is we're not going to take a moment to reflect upon why this is happening within our community, but instead we're going to look at the larger community and blame them. That's what I see happening. Well, in less than 2 weeks, a group of 538 people will officially choose the President of the United States. They are called electors, and they are specified in the Constitution. Most of us assume they are mere conduits for the will of voters and will cast their ballots consistent with Electoral College results. And yet in some states, they don't have to do that. They can do literally whatever they want. Texas is one of those states, and that's where we find Christopher Suprin. He's a Republican elector who says he will not vote for Donald Trump. Christopher joins us from Dallas. Christopher, thanks a lot for coming on tonight. So
thank you. I'm happy to be on your new show.
Thank you. I assume this election was over and that Trump won, and you're saying no.
That's correct. December 19th is when the election actually happens.
Right.
I'm actually surprised you didn't know that. But that's when electors actually cast their ballots, and that's when we will find out who is president.
Right. I guess and of course I'm aware of that. It's in the Article 2, it's in the 12th Amendment, it's well known, the Electoral College. But the idea that the result could change based on the meeting of the Electoral College in 2 weeks, I'm not aware that that could happen, and I think most people who cast their ballots last month assumed that the result they woke up to was the one that would stand, and you're saying no. Well, so here's the problem I have with it, and I think most people would. So you had an awful lot of people vote. I think it was around 128 million people voted overall in this election, 62-ish, 3 for Donald Trump. And here you have 538 people saying, or at least in your case, one person saying, my vote counts more than any of yours, and I'm going in a different direction. It seems undemocratic, is the point I'm making.
It may be undemocratic, but it's certainly exactly what the founders established. They wanted an electoral college, per Alexander Hamilton, to say no when it was appropriate for a candidate that they felt it was not preeminently qualified to be president.
Yeah, that's not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution, as you know. There's no reference to the motives of electors in the Constitution. But again, what gives you the power to do that? I mean, the whole point of the system is that you are standing in by proxy for millions of your fellow citizens and doing their will, and you're saying, in effect, I don't care what you think, I'm doing what I want, even though my job is to stand in for you, if you see the point.
Well, I disagree with the point. It's not to stand in for someone else. There's no constitutional assumption that the Electoral College is simply a rubber stamp. Otherwise, they would have simply said the states would award those values to those candidates. Again, it's not in the Constitution, but certainly in Federalist 68, the Founding Fathers had an idea that they were worried about a demagogue taking over office, simply winning by the mob mentality, and it hasn't happened. We've been lucky in America thus far, but this year's different.
Wait, I get it, and I get you don't like Trump, and I think that's totally fine if you don't like Trump. And a demagogue is a scary prospect from either side. But do you really want a country run by 538 people who are accountable to no one? That's what you're proposing. Why is that better?
Well, I'm not proposing
yeah, you are.
that.
You're saying I should be able to vote for anybody. I have authority vested in me by, I don't know where your authority comes from. I don't know how you became an elector. And yet you're saying, you know, just on the basis of my own conscience, I'm going to attempt to control the destiny of a country of 330 million. That seems as scary as a despotism to me.